Hey there, viewers. Here's something to think about. If you had one last chance to confess everything, would you tell the whole truth or take your secrets to the grave? Drop your thoughts in the comments. A prison guard just leaked Diddy's final confession from behind bars, and what he admitted might change everything we thought we knew. Let's get into it. Chapter 1. The body betrays the mind. Prison is loud in the quietest way possible. The hum of voices layered over the occasional clang of metal doors, the shuffle of feet down narrow hallways, the scratch of plastic trays sliding across concrete tables. It's all background noise, a rhythm you don't notice until something shifts. And lately, something had shifted. Diddy wasn't the first big name to come through MDC Brooklyn. Celebrities, politicians, white-collar criminals, they all ended up here when their money couldn't save them. At first, the name still carried weight. Guards whispered, inmates watched, some waiting to see if he'd act like he still ran the world. But after a while, even fame fades behind bars. The walls don't care who you are, and from what I could see, neither did the people inside them. But with Diddy it was different, not because of who he used to be, but because of what was happening to him now. I noticed it first in his walk. He used to move with a slow, careful pace, controlled, measured, like he was always calculating his next move. But lately, his steps had started to falter. He wasn't gliding across the floor like he used to. His knees would buckle slightly before catching himself, like his body was forgetting how to hold him up. His clothes were loose now, hanging off his frame in a way that didn't look intentional. Inmates lost weight all the time. The food was trash, stress did a number on the appetite. But this was different. The muscle, the bulk he used to carry was just gone. His fingers, long and knotted with veins, had started to tremble when he wasn't paying attention. When he gripped the edge of his tray at mealtime, his knuckles stood out against his thinning skin, his grip unsure. Some of the guys on the block noticed too. They always notice weakness. Yo, Diddy look like he's sick, man. Back in, trying to get that special treatment. Yeah? Then why he ain't eatin'? That part was true. He wasn't eating. At first I thought it was the usual act. Guys like him, they come in expecting the food to be different, like they still got a choice. But he wasn't making a scene about it. He wasn't complaining, wasn't demanding anything better. He just stopped. His tray would sit in front of him untouched, sometimes flipped over by the time the next count came around. And if you looked closely, you could see it wasn't just the food he was ignoring. He was losing time. I caught him staring at the wall in his cell, unmoving. Minutes passed, maybe more, before he even blinked. Other times, he'd rub his temples, like he was trying to shake off a headache that wouldn't go away. And the way he'd mumble under his breath, not to anybody, not even like he was praying, just talking to himself. At first I figured it was stress. Lock a man up long enough and his mind starts fighting back. But this was something else, something deeper, something worse. One day I was walking my round when I saw him trying to get up from his cot. He pushed against the mattress, his arms shaking with the effort, but his body didn't want to move. His breathing had changed too, labored, like he was fighting something invisible. For the first time, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't before. Not pity, just awareness. I stopped outside his cell, watching. "You good?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. His eyes were locked on the ground, unfocused. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Yeah," he muttered, barely above a whisper. But he wasn't. That same night I saw him in the yard, standing apart from the others. The cold air should have made him shiver, but he was still. His shoulders were hunched, his arms limp at his sides, and when he turned his head slightly, just enough for me to see his profile, his lips were moving again. No one was near him. I didn't say anything, didn't ask. I'd seen enough men unravel in real time to know when something was slipping. By the time the next morning rolled around, his condition had worsened. At breakfast, when trays were being passed down, his hands shook so bad he nearly dropped his. He didn't try to pick it up, just sat there, staring at his lap, his fingers twitching. His head swayed slightly like he was struggling to keep it up. I exchanged glances with another guard. Usually we didn't interfere unless we had to, but something about this didn't sit right. I didn't know if it was drugs, sickness, or something else entirely, but whatever it was getting worse fast. "Yo, Combs," another inmate called out. "You dying or what?" Diddy didn't react. The silence stretched out too long. That's when I knew. Most inmates, when they're playing weak, they make a show out of it. They groan, they whine, they make sure someone's watching. But this, he wasn't faking. I made the call to medical. A nurse came down later, pushing a cart with supplies. She was young, mid-20s, new to the job. I saw the moment she realized who she was treating, a flash of recognition in her eyes before she shut it down, forcing herself back into professional mode. She asked him questions. He barely answered. Checked his pulse. Not good. He was running cold. "Has he been eating?" "No," I answered for him. "Sleeping?" I didn't know. But if I had to guess, not much. The nurse scribbled something on her clipboard, then pressed the back of her hand against his forehead. Whatever she felt made her frown. "I need to get his vitals checked. He's not okay." I could tell she was holding back, but we all knew.
Something was wrong. And the worst part, even Diddy didn't seem to know what it was. He just sat there, blinking slow, like he was waiting for someone to tell him what came next.
Chapter 2. The Sudden Transfer. There's something about getting woken up in the middle of the night that sets a man on edge. It's the way the air feels different, heavier somehow, like it's thick with something unseen. That's what I remember most about that night, the weight of the silence, the way it pressed in from all sides like the whole prison was holding its breath. Diddy was asleep when they came for him, or at least as close to sleep as a man in his condition could get. His breathing had been shallow, barely noticeable, his body curled inward like he was trying to disappear into himself. The room was dim, the weak fluorescent light casting long shadows on the cinder block walls. He didn't stir when the door creaked open, didn't react when the two officers stepped inside. It wasn't until the cold steel of the cuffs snapped around his wrists that his eyes fluttered open, unfocused and slow, like his mind was struggling to catch up to his body. "Move," one of the officers said, his voice low and firm. No explanation, no warning. Diddy blinked, sluggish, disoriented. He looked smaller than he had when he first arrived, his frame swallowed by the baggy orange jumpsuit, his collarbone jutting out against the fabric. For a second he just sat there, like he wasn't sure if he was still dreaming. Then, with a jerky, unsteady movement, he swung his legs over the side of the cot, his bare feet meeting the cold concrete floor. He swayed slightly, his body fighting against him, but no one reached out to help. They just watched, waiting. I was standing at my usual post down the hall, watching the whole thing unfold. This wasn't standard. Transfers happened, sure, but they were never like this. There was always paperwork, some kind of protocol, and if an inmate was sick enough to need hospital care, the process was even more drawn out. Medical clearance, transportation approvals, all of it logged and filed. This was different. There were 4 officers in total, 2 in front, 2 in back, the kind of security detail we'd use for someone violent, someone who had a history of trying to run. Diddy wasn't that. Hell, the man could barely stand on his own. "Where's he going?" I asked one of the guys as they passed by, keeping my voice low. The officer didn't answer, just gave me a look, one I recognized. "Don't ask." Diddy shuffled forward, his steps uneven. He didn't resist, didn't ask questions, didn't try to slow them down. If anything, he looked relieved to be moving, like something inside of him had already accepted that whatever came next wasn't up to him. As they made their way down the corridor, the usual sounds of the prison seemed muted. No catcalls from inmates, no shouts from other guards. It was like the whole block had been prepped for silence. I followed at a distance, watching the way Diddy's head stayed down, his shoulders hunched. Not in submission, not in fear, just resignation. The van waiting outside was different too. Black, unmarked, not one of the standard prison transport vehicles. 2 men stood by the doors, not in correctional uniforms, but something else, something cleaner, more deliberate. They weren't here to escort him. They were here to deliver him. Diddy climbed inside without hesitation, the doors shut behind him. And just like that, he was gone. I went back inside, but the night felt wrong after that. The air in the corridors carried an unnatural stillness, like something had been taken out of the building, something unseen but heavy. None of the other guards talked about it. No one mentioned it at roll call the next morning. By noon, his name had been removed from the daily head count. No explanation, no paperwork, no record, like he'd never been there at all. Hours later, I heard the truth from a nurse on staff. She was young, fresh to the job, still shaken from whatever she'd seen earlier that morning. She came into the break room looking pale, her hands gripping the edge of the counter like she needed something solid to hold on to. "He's at Brooklyn Hospital," she said. I glanced up from my coffee. "Yeah? And?" She swallowed hard, her fingers tapping against the surface. "They cleared out the whole wing before he got there." That made me pause. Brooklyn Hospital wasn't small. It wasn't the kind of place that just shut down whole sections for a single patient. "Cleared it out?" I echoed. She nodded. "No other patients, no other staff, just him." I didn't say anything. Didn't have to. We both knew what it meant. When I clocked out that night, I found myself walking the long way to my car, my mind running through the details over and over. The extra security, the unmarked van, the way no one questioned it, the way no one even wanted to. I didn't know what he had told them, didn't know what he had done, or what he had been caught up in. But I knew one thing for sure. Whatever was happening to Diddy, it had nothing to do with justice. And for the first time since he walked through the doors of MDC Brooklyn, I wasn't sure if I'd ever see him again. Chapter 3. The Confession No One Heard. There was a time when I thought I had seen every way a man could break. I'd been at MDC Brooklyn long enough to witness the slow unraveling of a person's mind, the different ways it could happen. Some men fought it, raging against the inevitable, lashing out at anyone who got too close. Others went quiet, shrinking into themselves, folding inward like a dying thing trying to make itself smaller before the end. But Derry? He was doing something else entirely. He was waiting. At first I thought it was the usual. Prison gets to everybody eventually. The walls close in, time slows to a crawl, and the mind starts playing tricks. But with him it was more than that. It wasn't just stress. It wasn't just paranoia. He was waiting for something to break. It started with the whispering. I was making my usual rounds late one night when I heard a faint, rhythmic murmur coming from his cell. At first I thought he was praying. A lot of men turned to God in here, some for the first time in their lives. But this wasn't prayer. It wasn't pleading or begging. It was structured, rehearsed. I stopped just outside, keeping to the shadows where he wouldn't see me watching. He was sitting on the edge of his cot, his elbows on his knees, fingers pressing against his temples. His lips moved, forming words I couldn't quite catch, but there was a rhythm to them, a cadence. He wasn't just talking to himself. He was reciting. I listened for a while, trying to piece together what he was saying, but the words didn't make sense. Some of them were clear enough, names, maybe places, but the rest? It was like hearing half of a conversation, one side of something bigger. I've seen men crack before. I've seen them mutter, argue with people who weren't there. scream until their voices gave out. But this was different. Diddy wasn't arguing. He wasn't losing control. He was trying to remember something. I stepped closer, just enough to see the way his hands gripped his knees, his fingers twitching like he was holding on to something invisible. I called his name, but he didn't flinch, didn't react at all. He just kept whispering, his voice barely above a breath. Then suddenly he stopped. Just like that. The air in the cell felt heavy, thick, like the space between us had just closed in. Slowly he lifted his head. His eyes met mine through the bars, and for a second, just a second, I felt something cold settle in my chest. His eyes weren't wild. They weren't lost. They were calculating. "You need something, Combs?" I asked, keeping my voice even. He blinked, slow and deliberate, like he was waking up from a deep sleep. Then, after a pause that stretched too long, he shook his head. "No," he said, voice hoarse. "Not yet. Not yet." I left it alone after that. I didn't tell anyone what I saw, didn't report the whispering. What would I even say? That a prisoner had been talking to himself, that he looked at me funny. But it didn't sit right. And the next morning, things got even stranger. Diddy requested a meeting with his lawyer. Now that wasn't unusual in itself. He had a legal team working around the clock to get him out of here. But what was strange was the way he asked for it. Usually when a guy wants a meeting, it's urgent. They demand, they push, they insist on their rights. But Diddy, he didn't argue. Didn't even seem that eager. He just requested it, like he was setting something in motion. When the lawyer arrived, I watched from the observation window as they sat across from each other. The lawyer had a stack of paperwork, ready to go over case updates. He started talking, flipping through the pages, but Diddy wasn't listening. He was just sitting there, silent. His hands were folded on the table. His posture was relaxed, but wrong somehow. His lawyer kept talking, kept trying to get him to respond, but Diddy didn't move, didn't react. Minutes passed. Finally, the lawyer leaned forward, lowering his voice, probably trying to push him into engaging. That's when Diddy shook his head, slow, deliberate, and said nothing. I saw the moment his lawyer realized something was off, the tension in his shoulders, the way his mouth set into a thin line. He gathered his papers, stood up, and left without another word. Diddy didn't watch him go, didn't even look up. He just sat there, staring at the table. That night I found him exactly where he had been the night before, sitting on the edge of his cot, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. But this time, he wasn't whispering. He wasn't doing anything at all, just sitting. His breathing was slow, his expression blank, his eyes unblinking. I called his name. No reaction. I stepped closer, knocking the bars lightly with my baton. Still nothing. The air in the cell was thick, stagnant, like time had frozen. I don't know how long I stood there, watching him. Maybe seconds, maybe minutes. Then, without moving his head, without shifting an inch, he finally spoke. "You ever hear something that wasn't there?" His voice was steady. Too steady. I frowned. "What do you mean?" His lips parted slightly, like he was about to say something else, but then he closed them again, shook his head. "Never mind," he muttered. And just like that, he laid down, rolling onto his side, his back to me. That was it, conversation over. I stayed there for a moment longer, gripping the bars, trying to shake the uneasy feeling crawling up my spine. Then I turned and walked away. I'd seen men get lost in their own heads before, but this was different. He wasn't just breaking. He was waiting for something to break. And for the first time, I had the sinking feeling that when it did, none of us were going to be ready. Chapter 4. The eyes in the dark. Prison has a way of turning men into shadows. Some learn how to blend in, how to move quietly, how to disappear even when they're standing right in front of you. Others let the place consume them whole. They start losing pieces of themselves, little by little, until one day, what's left isn't a man anymore. Just an empty space where one used to be. I'd seen it before, plenty of times, but not like this. Not like him. Diddy had been slipping for a while, but it wasn't just the weight loss, the trembling hands, or the way he barely touched his food anymore. It was something deeper, something that ran beneath the skin, invisible but heavy, like a pressure that followed him wherever he went. At first, the other inmates ignored him. Some of them still whispered, cracking jokes about how the mighty had fallen, about how he wasn't built for this life. But then something changed. They stopped talking about him, stopped looking at him, stopped going near him. I noticed it in the yard first. There was always an unspoken hierarchy here. Who stood where? Who walked with who? Diddy had no crew, but he had a presence, even if it was just the weight of his name. But lately, when he moved, there was always space around him. No one wanted to get too close. It was subtle at first. A guy would be sitting at a table, and when Diddy approached, he'd get up, muttering something under his breath. In the common area, where inmates usually grouped up in clusters, there was always a gap wherever Diddy stood. It wasn't out of respect. It was something else. One night during head count, I overheard two guys talking. They were whispering, keeping their voices low, but in here, whispers always travel. He's lost it, man. Nah, he was already gone before he even got here. Yeah? Then tell me why the hell I saw him standing in his cell last night. Just standing there. So, maybe he couldn't sleep. That ain't the weird part. He was looking at the wall, talking. The other guy snorted. Talking to who? That's the thing, the first one muttered. Ain't nobody in there with him. I didn't say anything, but I listened. Later that night, I made my usual rounds. The hall was dim, the kind of quiet that only happens late at night when most of the block is asleep. Footsteps echoed in the distance, a guard pacing near the control room, but besides that, silence. Then I got to Diddy's cell. I stopped. He was standing in the dark. His back was to the door, his posture stiff. He wasn't moving, wasn't shifting from foot to foot the way most guys do when they're restless. He was just still, like a statue. Then his shoulders twitched. His head tilted slightly, just enough that I saw the side of his face in the dim light. His lips were moving, whispering. I took a step closer, pressing my hand against the cold bars. Combs. No response. Combs. His whispering stopped. For a long moment, he didn't turn around. I could hear his breathing, slow and steady, almost too steady, like he was controlling it on purpose. Then, finally, he lifted his head. You hear it too. His voice wasn't frantic, wasn't shaky. It was calm. Too calm. I frowned. He turned his head slightly, just enough so I could see his eyes, dark and hollowed out from lack of sleep. The knocking, he murmured. I didn't respond right away. I didn't know what to say. His lips twitched like he was waiting for something, like he thought I'd confirm it, agree with him. But I didn't. There ain't no knocking, Combs, I said finally. His expression didn't change. Not for you. I should have shut it down right then, told him to quit playing games, told him to sit down and go to sleep, but something about the way he said it made my skin crawl. Not for you. I cleared my throat. You need something? He studied me for a second before shaking his head. No. I exhaled through my nose, then get some sleep. He didn't argue, just turned back toward the wall, back into the dark, and lay down. But I stood there a little longer, watching, listening, and for the first time since he got here, I felt something close to fear. The next morning, things got worse. I was barely through my first cup of coffee when one of the guards on the early shift found me. He looked rattled, his jaw clenched tight. "You were on rounds last night?" he asked. I nodded. "You see anything weird?" I exhaled slowly, glancing toward the common area where inmates were already starting to gather. "Define weird." The guy shifted his weight, glancing around before lowering his voice. "I had an inmate call me over, said he heard something." "What kind of something?" He hesitated. "Said he heard talking, but not from inside a cell." I frowned. "Then where?" He swallowed. "From the hallway." I stared at him. He swore someone was out there, whispering. Said it wasn't no guard. Said it wasn't no inmate. I didn't react right away. My mind flicked back to Diddy's words. "Not for you." I shook it off. "Look, man, these guys are locked up 23 hours a day. Their minds play tricks. They hear shit that ain't there. It's nothing." He nodded, but I could tell he didn't believe it. Neither did I. That night, I did something I don't usually do. I stopped outside Diddy's cell again, not to check on him, not because I had to, just because I needed to know. The lights had dimmed for lights out, but my eyes adjusted quickly. He was sitting up again, not moving, not talking, just watching the door, like he was waiting for something, or someone. I don't know how long I stood there watching him, maybe seconds, maybe minutes. Then, slowly he turned his head and smiled. It was small, barely there, but I saw it. And that was the moment I knew. Whatever was happening to him, it wasn't just in his head anymore. Chapter 5, The Last Visitor. By the time the request came through, Diddy had been inside MDC Brooklyn long enough for the world to start forgetting about him. The headlines had thinned, the public outrage had dulled, and the industry had already begun to move on. In here, he was just another inmate, stripped of his power, reduced to a name on a roster. But something about him was different now. He had stopped taking visitors. Not just his legal team, not just family, everyone. There were no calls, no letters, no attempts to keep one foot in the outside world. He wasn't even checking his case updates anymore. At first, I thought it was because he knew the fight was over. A man like him, used to getting what he wanted, must have felt the full weight of his reality by now. But the more I watched, the more I realized it wasn't just resignation. It was intentional. He was shutting himself off from the world. Not in the way broken men did, retreating into themselves because they had no choice. Diddy had made a choice. Then, one afternoon, someone came for him. I had just started my shift when I saw the movement down the hall. One of the senior officers was escorting Diddy out of his cell, motioning for him to follow. At first, I thought it was another routine medical check, but something was off. Diddy wasn't cuffed. There were no guards in front or behind him, no extra security measures like last time. It wasn't a forced transfer. And for the first time in weeks, he didn't resist. Didn't ask questions. Didn't even hesitate. He just got up. His movements were slow, methodical, like a man who already knew where he was going, like he had been expecting this. I wasn't on visitor duty that day, but I found a reason to be nearby, lingering close enough to catch a glimpse through the small glass window of the visitation room. And what I saw made my stomach turn. Diddy walked in and stopped cold. For a split second, I saw something flicker across his face. Not shock, not fear. Something deeper. Then, just as fast, it was gone. He lowered himself into the metal chair across from the visitor, his posture stiff, unnatural. Whoever was sitting across from him was no one I recognized. The visitor log was empty. No lawyer, no family, no industry friends. No record of anyone arriving at all. But someone was there, and they had gotten through. I stood at the observation window, watching. I couldn't hear what was being said, but I didn't need to. Diddy never looked away. Not once. He wasn't nodding, wasn't reacting. He just sat there, listening. Then, all at once, his hands curled into fists. Tight, bone-white knuckles pressing against the metal table. I had never seen him like that before. I had seen him sick. I had seen him weak. I had seen him unravel. But this was something else. This was rage. Not loud, not explosive. Just contained, boiling, controlled. Like a man swallowing fire. It lasted only a moment. Then, just as fast, it was gone. His fingers uncurled, his shoulders relaxed. He leaned back in his chair, his expression blank. The visitor said something else, something quieter, leaning in just slightly. Diddy didn't react, didn't nod, didn't move. He didn't even blink. And when the visitor stood up to leave, he didn't watch them go. He just stared straight ahead. I waited for him to move, to do something, anything, to show that he was still engaged with reality. But he sat there long after the visitor was gone, still as a statue. I stepped away before the officers cleared the room, but something about it wouldn't leave my head. Something about that moment. The way he had clenched his fists, the way his entire body had shifted for that brief, almost imperceptible moment of fury. Diddy was a man who had spent his whole life controlling people, and now someone had gotten to him. Later that evening, I started asking around. I didn't expect any real answers, but I wanted to confirm at least one thing: who the hell had come to see him? But every person I asked gave me the same response. There's no visitor record. The system had nothing. No sign of a scheduled meeting. No log of anyone entering the facility. No paperwork, no signatures, no clearance. Like it had never happened. And yet, I had seen it. I had watched it with my own eyes. I had seen the way Diddy reacted. And that's what kept me up that night. Because someone had spoken to him. And whatever they said, it had changed something. When he was brought back to his cell later that night, something about him wasn't the same. He wasn't afraid anymore. He wasn't sick, wasn't sluggish, wasn't lost in his own mind. He looked resigned. And for the first time, I had this sick, sinking feeling that he already knew what was coming next. I didn't sleep that night. Because when a man stops fighting, stops running, stops hoping, it usually means he's reached the end of the road. And I had a terrible feeling that for Diddy, that road was about to run out. Chapter 6. The Night of the Knock. The prison had a way of feeling different at night. The noise that usually filled the air, the distant hum of conversation, the occasional scrape of plastic trays, the echo of heavy boots on concrete, was gone. In its place was something else, something heavier. Silence in a place like this wasn't peaceful. It was unnatural. I had already finished my shift. I wasn't supposed to be walking the blocks anymore, but habit kept me moving. Maybe it was the way my gut had been tight all day, or maybe it was the look Diddy had when he came back from that damn visit. Something about it wouldn't leave my mind. I took the long way back to the security wing, letting my boots fall heavy on the ground, letting the familiar weight of my keys jingle at my side. It was late, past midnight. The air inside MDC Brooklyn was thick, still, the kind of stillness that made you feel like something was watching. That's when I heard it. The 3 knocks. Sharp, slow, deliberate. I stopped, turning my head toward the sound. It had come from his cell. I rounded the corner, my pulse steady but my instincts buzzing, my fingers already grazing the baton at my waist. When I reached his door, I stopped cold. He was waiting for me, standing right there, close to the bars, his face barely illuminated by the dim light leaking in from the hallway. The angles of his face had sharpened to something almost inhuman, cheekbones too defined, skin stretched thin over his skull, his eyes sunken but wide open. He looked worse than before, thinner, paler, like whatever life had been left in him had been drained out since that visit. And for the first time in weeks, he spoke first. "I need to talk." His voice was raw, hoarse from disuse, like the words had been sitting in his throat too long, turning to rust before he finally forced them out. I didn't answer right away. Wasn't protocol to just stand there, listening to an inmate in the middle of the night. But something about his tone stopped me. This wasn't a man looking for favors. This wasn't a man trying to negotiate. This was a man who had already decided what needed to be said. I stepped closer, gripping the cold steel of the bars, keeping my posture straight, unreadable. "Talk about what?" For a long moment, he didn't respond. Then, so quietly I almost didn't hear it, he said, "You need to listen carefully, because once I say this, I'm not repeating it." His fingers curled tighter around the bars, knuckles bone white. His breathing was shallow, each inhale slow and measured, like he was pulling air through a straw. Then, he started talking, and I felt my stomach drop. Because what he told me that night, it didn't just sound like a confession. It sounded like a warning. He spoke in pieces, not rushed, not frantic. Each word was carefully chosen, deliberately placed. At first, I thought he was finally about to spill, finally about to admit to something from his past, maybe give up the names that everyone outside these walls had been whispering about for years. But it wasn't about his past. It was about now. "It's already set in motion," he said, voice low, almost too quiet for me to hear. I thought maybe they needed me to fix it, maybe they'd keep me around, but I was wrong. I frowned. "Who?" He ignored the question. "I saw the signs too late," he muttered. "I thought I was in control. That's what they let me believe, but they don't need me anymore." Something about the way he said it made my skin prickle. "They?" I asked, my voice firmer this time. He exhaled slowly, his grip tightening on the bars. His eyes flickered to the side, scanning the empty hallway, like he expected someone to be standing there, listening. "They're already covering their tracks," he said, tying up loose ends. I felt my chest tighten. I had heard men talk like this before, men who knew too much about the wrong people. "They let me rot in here for a reason," he continued, "not because they couldn't get me out, but because they were deciding what to do with me, how to erase me." I stared at him, my pulse a slow, steady drum in my ears. "I ain't stupid," he added, his voice suddenly colder, sharper. "I know how this ends." A long silence stretched between us. He wasn't looking at me anymore. His gaze had drifted past me, down the hall, into the dark. His breathing had slowed, his hands loosened from the bars, falling back to his sides. And that's when I realized this wasn't a confession. This was a man already saying his goodbyes. I should have walked away then. Should have left him standing there, talking to the shadows, let him sink back into whatever hole he was falling into. But something about it, about him, about the way he looked, the way he sounded, kept me rooted in place. "You think they're gonna kill you?" I asked, voice low. He didn't answer right away. Then, after a pause too long to be natural, he smiled. It wasn't a real smile. It was small, bitter, empty. "You don't get it," he said, shaking his head. I stayed quiet, waiting. And they already did. A cold sensation ran down my spine. I opened my mouth, ready to demand a real answer, but before I could, I heard it. Footsteps. Someone was coming. Diddy's head snapped toward the sound, his shoulders going stiff. Then, just as quickly, his entire body relaxed. Like he had been expecting it. Like it didn't surprise him at all. I turned my head, catching the glint of a flashlight beam bouncing off the walls. When I turned back to face Diddy, his expression had changed. The fear was gone. The resignation was back. He stepped away from the bars, walked to his cot, and sat down. Just like that. I hesitated, my grip on the bars tightening. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But whatever he had been about to tell me, it didn't matter anymore, because someone else had just decided it was time for him to stop talking. And for the first time since he walked through these doors, I had a gut feeling that whatever came next, he already knew how it was going to end. Chapter 7. The silence that followed. Something changed after that night. It was like a switch had been flipped inside him, shutting off whatever was left. Before, even at his weakest, Diddy still carried an air of resistance. However small, however fragile, there was still a part of him that clung to the idea that this was temporary, that he was still in control of something, even if it was just himself. But now there was nothing. No fight, no defiance, no even pretending to play along. Just a man sitting in a cage, waiting for something no one else could see. At first I thought it was just exhaustion. He had barely been sleeping before, and whatever weight was already hanging over him had finally come crashing down. Maybe that was it. Maybe he had just given up. But the longer I watched him, the more I realized this wasn't the kind of surrender that came from a man who had lost hope. This was something else. It wasn't that he had lost the will to keep going, it was that he had made a decision. And that's what made it worse. The first thing I noticed was that he stopped reacting. I don't mean he stopped fighting. He hadn't fought anything in a long time. I mean he stopped acknowledging the world around him altogether. Guards would call his name and he'd turn his head slightly like he had heard it, but he wouldn't answer, wouldn't nod, wouldn't even give the usual dull, lifeless stare most inmates did when they were fed up with authority. It was like he didn't see us anymore, like his mind was somewhere else. His food tray would be slid through the slot in his door 3 times a day, and 3 times a day it would sit there, untouched. The steam from the food would curl up and disappear into the cold air, the once warm meal turning stiff and unappetizing, but he wouldn't even glance at it. Some of the other guards joked that maybe he thought he was still too good for prison food, but I knew better. This wasn't a hunger strike. This wasn't someone making a statement. It was like his body no longer recognized hunger at all. Even the other inmates noticed. Guys who had taunted him before, calling him washed up, laughing about how a man who once had the world at his feet was now sleeping on a slab of concrete, stopped. Not because they suddenly found sympathy, not because they had grown a conscience, but because they felt it too. Something was wrong with him. Not sick, not weak, not even broken. Just wrong. Like a man who wasn't really there anymore. I remember walking past his cell one night, long after lights out, expecting to see him curled up on his cot like he always was. But he wasn't. He was sitting on the floor, his back pressed against the cold concrete wall, his legs stretched out in front of him. His head was tilted just slightly downward, his hands resting limply in his lap. He wasn't asleep. His eyes were open, unfocused, staring at something I couldn't see. I stood there for a long time, watching, waiting for him to move, to blink, to shift even slightly, but he didn't. It was like he had been drained of everything that made him human. I knocked on the bars with my baton, the sound loud in the empty corridor. "Combs?" I said, keeping my voice low. "Nothing." "Calmed," I said again. This time slowly, his head lifted, his gaze met mine, but it was empty, like looking into a house after the lights had gone out. There was no anger, no frustration, no sadness, just nothing. For a second, I thought he was about to speak. His lips parted slightly, just enough for a breath to escape, but then, nothing. He closed his mouth again and turned his head away, as if even acknowledging me had been too much effort. I don't know what I had expected after that confession. Maybe I thought he'd fight back, try to negotiate something, push for a way out. Maybe I thought he'd beg, finally crack under the weight of it all and say what needed to be said. But he didn't. He just sat there, waiting. For what? I still don't know. The weirdest part? No one seemed to be paying attention anymore. The guards who used to keep a close eye on him, the ones who had whispered about his case, the ones who had been briefed to watch him for any signs of distress, had started acting like he wasn't there, like they had already moved on to the next headline, the next high-profile inmate. It was subtle at first, little things. His name being left off reports, his schedule no longer being part of the usual discussions. Then one day, I checked the roster for our weekly rounds and saw something that made my stomach drop. Diddy's name wasn't on it. Not listed under medical watch, not scheduled for legal visits. Not even marked as general population. Just gone. But he was still here. Still sitting in that same cell, still staring at the same walls, still breathing the same stale air. And when I brought it up to one of the senior officers, he just shrugged. Probably a clerical error, he said, his tone dismissive. I didn't believe that. And I don't think he did either. That night I went back to his cell again, just to see if he was still there, just to make sure I hadn't imagined the last few weeks. And when I got there, I found him in the exact same position, back against the wall, hands resting in his lap, eyes open, staring straight ahead. I don't know what made me do it, but I stepped closer, close enough that my boots were nearly touching the bars. "They took your name off the records," I said, voice barely above a whisper. For the first time in days, I saw something flicker in his expression. Not shock, not fear, something else. Something like acceptance. I exhaled, the weight in my chest pressing heavier than before. "What are you waiting for?" I asked, though I wasn't sure if I wanted to hear the answer. Diddy blinked slowly, his gaze shifting toward mine. He stared at me for a long time, the silence stretching thick between us. Then finally his lips parted. They already decided. My stomach turned. Who? But he didn't answer. He just looked away. And for the first time, I had the sick realization that whatever had been happening to him, whatever had been set in motion, was already too far gone to stop. That night, I didn't sleep, because there was only one kind of prisoner who disappeared from the system without ever leaving their cell. And I had the terrible feeling that soon, Diddy was going to become one of them. Chapter 8. The last thing he said. The last time I saw him, he was sitting exactly where I had come to expect him, back against the cold concrete wall, hands folded in his lap, eyes open but empty. He wasn't asleep. He never really slept anymore, not in the way a person should. He just sat there, motionless, like something inside him had already left, but his body hadn't gotten the message yet. It had been almost a week since he had spoken to me at the bars that night. A week since he had told me that something was set in motion. A week since I had started noticing the little things, how fewer people mentioned his name, how his paperwork was vanishing from the system, how even the inmates who used to watch him like vultures circling a dying animal now gave him a wide berth. What? It was like he had already become a ghost, and the world was just catching up. I didn't know why I went back to his cell that morning. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was instinct. Maybe some part of me just needed to know if he was still breathing, if there was still something left of the man who had walked into this prison thinking he was untouchable. I walked up slowly, resting my hand against the bars, watching him. He didn't move. "You still alive in there?" I asked, my voice low, careful. It was a stupid thing to say, but I wanted to see if he'd react. He didn't flinch, didn't turn his head. For a second I thought he was gone. Maybe not physically, but mentally, lost somewhere I couldn't reach. Then, just when I was about to turn and walk away, his lips parted. And what he said still sits with me. Hey, they don't need me anymore. His voice was quiet, matter of fact. Not scared. Not angry. Just final. Something cold settled in my chest. I knew that tone. I had heard it before. Not from him. Not from someone like him. But from men who knew their fate had already been decided. Men who had been waiting for something inevitable. For the first time in my career, I felt something close to fear. I don't know what I was expecting him to say after that. Maybe an explanation, maybe another cryptic warning. But he didn't offer anything else. He just stared straight ahead, like he had already moved on. That was the last thing he ever said. The next morning, he was gone. Not transferred. Not moved to a new cell. Just gone. No paperwork, no escort, no chain of custody, nothing. His name wasn't on the rosters anymore. His inmate ID was wiped from the system, like he had never been here at all. I spent the first few hours asking around, checking logs, pulling strings where I could, but no one had an answer. Some of the newer guards shrugged, said maybe he had been relocated. The older ones, the ones who had been here long enough to recognize when something wasn't right, just gave me that same look. The look that meant, don't ask. I knew better than to push too hard, but the silence was worse than any answer I could have gotten. I walked back down to his cell, half expecting to see him still there, sitting in that same position, staring at something no one else could see. But the cell was empty. The bed was stripped, the walls were bare. Even the air felt different. A place where someone had been just hours before shouldn't feel so hollow, so untouched, but it did. Like no one had ever been there at all. I don't know what happened to him. I don't know where they took him, or who they even were. All I know is that a man with that much money, that much influence, doesn't just disappear. Not without someone making it happen. And whatever he confessed that night, whatever truth had finally slipped past his lips, it was enough to erase him. I didn't ask about him again after that, not because I didn't want to know, but because I already did. Some men disappear because they run. Some disappear because they're forgotten. But the ones like him, they disappear because someone decided they should. And those are the kinds of ghosts you don't chase. Those are the kinds of ghosts that don't leave behind footprints. Only silence.